In front of this sunset, this mundane phenomenon that we've seen billion times in the past, and then we see a billion times in the future. In front of this sunset, our body filled with powerful feeling, and we utter the word beautiful. How many times will our mouths utter this word? Even though I say the same word every time, beautiful. I know that each time the sunset is different, often the place is different, and that I'm different. But the word coming out of my mouth is always the same, beautiful. Do I feel the sunset beauty first, then say beautiful? Or does say the word beautiful open me up more to feel the sunset's beauty? Which comes first? Either way, we all know for sure that the word beautiful is not enough. Many people who have traveled to Manchuria have written or said that the sunset is so large and so red. Unfortunately, when I was in Manchuria, I never had opportunity to see a large red sunset. My hope to see a Manchurian sunset is still unfulfilled,
Days.
but
It's dark
the
underground.
image remains in my
You
mind,
hear nothing.
larger
nothing.
and redder
You hear
than
the steps
any
of
other
death.
beautiful sunset I've
They
seen in
fought
my
to
life.
the end, to the disappearance of Manchuria. They were on the border. Once the Soviet army fired, they lost contact with their headquarters. They didn't know that the war was over. They continued to fight. Many Chinese were killed before the Japanese started dying. They were kidnapped or arrested for no reason and sent to the border, where they dug and dug until they died or were killed. They were building permanent underground
My father went to
fortresses
war a long
to
time
defend
ago.
against the Soviet menace.
When he was
on
drunk,
this side
he used to tell me
of the
about his
Manchuria
life in the
border.
army. All soldiers who return from war have a lot to tell. Maybe as much as what they don't want to tell. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. The most important thing was that my father was talking to me about his life, about his real experience. Some of his stories thrilled me like ancient war stories in books. Others were miserable to hear even for a kid. Senior officers were always slapping soldiers' faces without a reason. Like any young man, my father had to adapt to army life, and he worked hard at it, like he did for everything else. He always wanted to be a winner, to be in first place, and so became a sniper. Near the war's end, a commander called my father's troop together. Each soldier was handed a landmine and ordered to suicide attack an enemy's tank. My father went into battle without a rifle, but with a landmine strapped against his stomach. He lay in wait for a tank in a foxhole. I was always afraid to ask, how long? However long he waited, no tank came. When the war ended, he was captured as a POW and sent to a series of Siberian labor camps, where he spent the rest of his young manhood. 600,000 Japanese, mostly men, performed forced heavy labor under extremely severe conditions. The cold, hunger, and fatigue killed many of them without mercy. My father was there. He may not have won first place, but did not die there, and he did come back. This is what I know of my father's war.
Nights and days, it's dark underground. Heavy air, high humidity, and the smell of dirt drape like a veil over the soldiers' souls. You hear the explosions coming toward you. Vibrations tell you the enemy is right above you. You are still alive in the underground.
In 1932, Imperial Japan founded and administered the state of Manchukuo in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. On August 9, 1945, Manchukuo began to perish. By August 15th, it had literally disappeared from the earth. It was frail. Its 13-year history ended in 1 week. After the Soviet army overpowered the organized Japanese resistance, Chinese communists and nationalists scrambled for the land Manchukuo had occupied. All Japanese people remaining in the area were abandoned by the Japanese government. 1.5 million people found themselves no place to go, though none of them wanted to believe it. Those who didn't lose their lives lost everything else: property, assets, families. It was on that date, August 9th, when the Soviet army crossed the border into Manchukuo, that my father had been ordered into the foxhole with a landmine strapped against his stomach. His army superior had asked soldiers to become human bombs, to engage in suicide missions against the Soviet tanks to buy time for just a half day or so, and my father had volunteered. Because no tanks came by the foxhole where he lay, ready at any minute to detonate himself, my father lived and was sent to the Siberian labor camps.
When they built this underground permanent fortress, the Japanese force was strong and well trained. They were called the Invincible Kwantung Army and were the pride of Manchukuo in the Imperial Army. After 1943, the elite forces were slowly and secretly withdrawn and relocated to the South Pacific Front. By 1945, they were all replaced by untrained conscripts. A tiger made out of paper mache. But they fought well and held their position for more than 10 days after the war was over.
"62 years after he lay in that foxhole, I found a piece of paper in the Engo Kyoku, Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, Japan. It was a copy of a brief account that my father wrote in Maizuru, Japan, when he arrived from Siberia in 1947. He had survived this experience, too. The account listed his personal and military information and where he had been detained in Siberia. Since all Manchukuo's local and military documents had been burnt to ashes, this piece of paper was the only record of his experiences. It became the lodestar for my research and navigated my journey in China and Russia. January 26, 1942. Adoption at Kanto Armed Forces General Headquarters, Technology Junior Clerk. March 7, 1945. Entering Manchuria 75-74 Corps as an active soldier. April 1st. Transferred to the 74th Unit. August 1st. Transfer to Manchuria 21095 Corps. August 9th. Transfer to the 5th Military Headquarters. Participate in a battle. August 20th. Ceasefire, disarmed. August 22nd. Entering a camp at Rakou, Wudanjang. September 15th. Entering Soviet Union at Pogranishny. September 19th. Arrived in Kamen Rybolov. October 20th. Arrived at the camp in Ilinka, present Miskoye. January 18th, 1946. Arrived at the camp in Galiunki. January 21st. Arrived at the camp in Ilichevka. April 15th. Arrived at the camp in Galiunki. May 9th, arrived at the camp in Nahodka. June 18th, arrived at the Nahodka camp number 2. December 28th, entered the Nahodka camp number 1 for preparation returning to mainland Japan. January 2nd, 1947, departure at Nahodka. January 6th, arrived at Maizuru, Japan. January 7th, landing at Maizuru. January 8th, demobilized. My father turned 84 this last August. He has lost many memories. He just doesn't remember much anymore about his time in the army and the labor camps, except for a few pleasant memories. Maybe this isn't so bad for him, but it made my research difficult. I often found myself going to the wrong resources and locations to do research, and going back and forth trying to retrace his steps. It was hard to stay focused and to believe I could reconstruct his history, but while I tried to find evidence of his story, I learned many other stories about Manchuria and its people, and about story itself. All experience inevitably becomes story. When he was young, my father told me his stories. He doesn't tell them anymore, not because he doesn't want to, but because he can't. After I found the record of his life after the country's defeat in Manchuria, I interviewed him on several occasions. He didn't talk much, but I did. I listened to him about what I found and what I guessed from my research. He listened in silence. My mother listened to our dialogues and said that a person who didn't experience something sometimes knows it better than one who did. This might not be too far from what a story is really about and how reality is ultimately constructed. The more we try to grasp and interpret reality, the more it slides away from whatever was really real.
Nights and days, it's dark underground. Extreme tension invites you to fall asleep, and you fall into a dream. Dream of thirst, thirst of life, life of real, real of darkness. Explosion crushes your dream. Wake up, dream of real. Face the darkness. You lose your balance. You find yourself in nowhere.
He marched. He marched to Siberia. He marched past many dead bodies on the way to Siberia. He marched like the Soviet army had marched a month before, but in the opposite direction. He marched with a large red sunset on his back. He had survived one round with death about 200 kilometers west from the Manchurian border, in the foxhole with a landmine, and now he marched across the border toward the second round, the Siberian labor camp. Now I knew where he had gone before he knew. I told him exactly where he had been and when he had been there. I told him when and where he had harvested rice and lumbered timber. He listened in silence and nodded. It seemed he thought my story or his story was okay. He neither approved nor disapproved. It seemed he left what I said open as a possibility, as if these were possible versions of his past and his futures. I wanted to see where he had spent his youth in northeastern China and in Siberia. It was a strange and vague desire. Maybe I was pushed by my own blood. My father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had gone to Manchuria for work. Based on the brief account of my father's life that I found at the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, I tried to visit all the places my father had been, from the villages of Hendaohej, Rako, Doning, and Mudanjiang in northeastern China, to the labor camps Kamenrabolov, Ilinka, Moskoye, Galeonke, Ilichevka, and Nahodka in Russia. In some places, I could identify exactly where he had been, and in others, I couldn't. Whether I knew his exact location or not, I felt a common strangeness in the places he had been, like I was standing in front of a void. In Daoning, China, I found an old building still standing right next to a place where an office once existed and where my father once worked with joy. In Galeonke, Russia, I found a totally empty field that was once one of the labor camps where he had been interned. In neither of these locations did I experience the emotion I had expected. Instead, I felt like a void standing in front of a void. Wherever I visited my father's past, whether physical traces remained or not, I felt that I myself was the void, that I was alienated from everything there, out of time and place, floating through lost memories that weren't my own. You visit a place and you're told you visited once as a child, but you don't remember. You are physically there. You're told you've been there, but you feel like you haven't arrived there yet. Probably it's because I was trying to relive someone else's past. I was trying to relive my father's past. The camps were scattered over the vast land of Siberia. Even though the camps I visited represent only a small portion of Siberia, I had to drive long distances every day. I was literally lost in the void a few times because there was no one to ask directions. While I drove the long distances between camps, I couldn't help trying to imagine how my father marched from one camp to another. A dirt path runs from one point to another point, and the line of that path is so long. The vast empty world is unreal and abstract even in early summer. When the winter comes, white ground and white sky stretch as far as you can see. The white void of Siberia swallows everything in a silence. On clear winter mornings, someone said, "It's too cold for the stars." The Big Dipper is frozen. It can't move in the sky. Wind and hunger tell you that you are still alive. Time means nothing. Nothing means space. Your heartbeat is all it defines where you begin and end. Every time I stood in front of the emptiness that I found in the trace of my father's youth, I asked myself, why am I here? What is this for? And I realized the void I faced on the physical landscape was the same void as I faced in my father's silence while I interviewed him in my home. Maybe my story, my father's story, maybe all stories are forms of emotional hypertext. Jorge Luis Borges writes in his 1975 The Book of Sand, "The line is made up of an infinite number of points, the plane of an infinite number of lines, the volume of an infinite number of planes,
Nights and days,
the
it's dark
hypervolume
underground.
of an infinite number of volume."
You'll fight until the end,
No,
but the end
unquestionably,
won't come.
this is not
It's
the best way
deferred,
to beginning
only
my story.
anticipation.
To claim that is
Nights and
true is
days,
nowadays the convention
it's
of
dark
every made-up
underground.
story.
One
Mine,
day I lay
however,
there
is true.
with no memory.